Hey guys, here we are at part 5 of the story, where the Toads raise Naruto to replace Minato as their summoner. Trained as a sage, Naruto will strike out to find his fellow Jinchuriki. Just not in the way you would expect. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe button. Now, let's jump right in. The tension in the room was palpable, not that it fazed the 6 world leaders sitting in an elongated semicircle in the middle of it. The only one not sitting at the single curved table was Mifune, who sat off to the side at his own, much smaller table. As the neutral host of the proceedings, it made sense. And as the host, it was his duty to breach the topic of why the 5 Hokage were meeting in the first place. As a neutral country, the Land of Iron welcomes you all, and while we have not heard much of this Akatsuki organization, I assume that it is a concern to all of you. It would certainly explain why both Lord Hokage and Lady Hokage called for a meeting. Perhaps they can tell us why this meeting became necessary. Tsunade stood up at the same moment as the Hokage, and the bodyguards tensed in the balcony as the 2 hidden village leaders stared each other down. After a second, the Hokage blustered forward, and Tsunade sat back down, willing herself to let it slide. Akatsuki captured the Hidden Cloud's second Jinchuriki very recently. To be perfectly tactless, our spies have informed us that there is only one Jinchuriki left to the hidden villages as a whole. Akatsuki must be stopped. The bodyguards twitched before settling down again once they realized that the Hokage's angry pounding was just that, and posed no threat to anyone but the desk in front of him. Both bodyguards and Hokages alike looked around for any clues as to which village still had their tailed beast. Seeing the other Hokages and bodyguards doing the same thing, there was only one conclusion to draw. And it was Mifune who drew it first. And I see that the one village with a tailed beast left is the only one not in attendance. Should we postpone until my messengers can reach the hidden waterfall? The other Hokages almost groaned at the thought of spending any more time in the Land of Iron than necessary, but the Hokage actually grinned. That won't be necessary, or possible. Akatsuki did attack the hidden waterfall to get the 7 tails, and they succeeded in wiping the village off the face of the map, though it remains so hidden I doubt anyone has really noticed yet. If there had been more people present, the Hokage's announcement would have no doubt sent murmurs and whisperings rippling throughout the room. As it was, the other Hokage and their bodyguards settled for wearing various expressions of surprise and horror. "This is a most disturbing development," said the Tsuchikage, hand raised to his chin in thought. "And I don't suppose you'll tell us how you've come to know of this attack?" Information was power in the ninja world, and brash, young people like the Hokage showed off their power on a regular basis. So the wizened old man wasn't all that surprised when the muscle-bound Hokage dipped his hand. "I know because 2 survivors came to my village, seeking refuge. One of them was the Jinchuriki herself." With a dramatic flourish, the Hokage pointed up to the banner behind him, which bore the kanji for lightning. Fu stuck her head out from behind the cloth and waved at the assembled ninja below with a small smile on her face. "Today, the world shall know pain, and through it, peace." Pain turned towards the other 8 members of Akatsuki assembled before him, in addition to Orochimaru's squad. Almost every member of Akatsuki had followers on their payroll, though Orochimaru was the only one who had any that were worth something in a fight. "We shall go in, defeat the 5 Hokage, and secure the Jinchuriki." "Where the fuck is Zetsu?" asked Hidan, with his usual amount of tact. "Did the pansy chicken out of a good fight?" "Which Zetsu are you referring to?" asked Sasori sarcastically. "Regardless, he's both inside already, waiting for the perfect moment to strike." Naruto got up from his meditative position. "There's a whole lot of samurai on the lower floors, but the only people up top are the Hokage and their bodyguards. There don't appear to be any barriers, but I've been wrong before." Pain nodded at the members of Akatsuki, and they all followed him towards the large meeting hall of the Hokage. As they all leapt through the trees, Naruto dropped back next to Kisame. "He's here. Outside the building. On this path, we'll barely miss him." Kisame's sharp-toothed smile widened to nightmarish proportions as he veered off course to intercept a target he wanted to fight. The rest of Akatsuki continued onward to a fight that would lead to peace, destruction, or both. Sasuke leaned up against the tree, keeping a clear line of sight with the large building where the meeting was taking place. He had been told to not enter the building, as the last thing a peace negotiation needed was for the Hokage to find out that the Hidden Cloud's source was one of her own missing ninja. If Akatsuki attacked, the building would likely not be in mint condition for long. When the building began to explode, Sasuke would move in, and hope he wasn't too late to find a member of Akatsuki. Now that his eyes were fully healed, his basic Sharingan took next to no chakra to maintain, and it was only the fact that he had them active that he managed to notice the attack. He leapt to the side as the large shark made entirely of water crashed down on where he had been standing. Jumping higher up into the branches of the trees, Sasuke began to jump towards the cage summit building. Water style, flying fish. Sasuke looked over his shoulder to see another watery fish flying behind him, slowly gaining ground. His hand lit up with a shriek of lightning, and he turned around midair to face the shark. Chidori mine. The ball of lightning simply stopped where it was, and exploded when the shark touched it. The water style fell to the ground like rain, and Sasuke whipped out his sword to block the incoming strike. He was swatted down to the ground as if his katana had been used to try and stop a building from crushing him, only it was even less effective. Sasuke crawled out of the crater in the snow he had made, and looked upon the strangest Akatsuki member he had seen, perhaps with the exception of Zetsu. He was a good 6 feet tall, and carried a sword covered in bandages that might have been as tall as he was. But the strange part was his blue skin, and the gills that seemed to be a part of his cheeks. Sasuke also noticed the Akatsuki cloak he wore, and he enviously noted that it was likely much warmer than his own cloak. "You know, usually I'm the one killing my teammates," said the shark man, and Sasuke noted the pointed teeth. "Now that you've killed Itachi, I get a chance to see what avenging a fallen comrade feels like. Care to help me experience that?" Amaterasu. Sasuke did not feel like helping this Akatsuki member get revenge for the only living Uchiha's older brother. And he didn't waste any time as his eternal Mangekyo Sharingan spun to life and shot black flames as hot as the sun. The shark just brought up his sword like a large shield, and the black fire of Amaterasu hit the blade. Sasuke's Sharingan widened as the black fire that was able to burn for 7 days in a heavy downpour was simply sucked into the sword, which seemed to grow a bit larger. The swordsman grinned, and it was then that Sasuke realized that he was fighting another one of the 7 ninja swordsmen of the Bloody Mist Village. Years ago, he had had a run-in with Zabuza, and if it hadn't have been for Kakashi, he would have died then and there. Now he was fighting someone just as strong, if not stronger, alone. "Saimata and I are in agreement. Your fire isn't nearly as strong as Itachi's," said the Akatsuki swordsman. "But I guess that just means I can feel a bit nostalgic while I tear you to shreds. I'm Kisame Hoshigaki, and my blade and I are going to eat you alive." Sasuke brought up his sword, and blue lightning shrieked down the blade as he ran at Kisame. "Fancy yourself a swordsman? Let me show you how wrong you are," shouted Kisame as he leapt to the challenge. Their swords clashed, but Sasuke was ready for Saimata's bulk this time, and his sword simply rolled away. Sasuke twirled his sword around, and sliced Kisame across the face as he continued past the legendary swordsman. Sasuke grinned as he turned to face the bleeding swordsman, but he was annoyed to see that his attack had only left a tiny scratch on the Akatsuki member's cheek. It would have been more effective, but Sasuke's Sharingan had noticed his opponent's sword eat the lightning chakra right off his own blade. The feeling was only annoyance though, which was infinitely superior to the burning pain that shot up his leg a second later. Looking down, Sasuke saw the mess that used to be the back of his calf. "Unlike your pathetic excuse for a sword, Saimata only needs a moment of contact to cripple its prey," bragged Kisame, swinging Saimata over his shoulder confidently. Sasuke glared at the Akatsuki member, and the Sharingan in his left eye spun wildly. Kisame looked up in confusion as the sky became blood red, and the clouds began to move backwards across the sea of red. He looked down in pain and shock at his right hand, which still clutched Saimata as it fell to the ground. Kisame turned to look at Sasuke, who had moved without Kisame even seeing a blur as he cut off the legendary swordsman's hand. "You might be the better swordsman, but this is my world now," said Sasuke as he stood up slowly. Kisame howled in pain as another sword impaled him from behind. Looking over his shoulder, Kisame saw another Sasuke clutching the sword behind him. Kisame felt a familiar presence crawling up his arm from where his hand had been cut off, and he closed his eyes, grunting as even more swords stabbed through him. Kisame opened his eyes just in time to swat Sasuke away with Saimata as the Uchiha leapt at him for the finishing blow. Breathing heavily, Kisame glared at the Uchiha. "So sorry, but your genjutsu is nowhere near Itachi's level. It's plenty god, but my partner is always there to break me out of a nasty genjutsu." Sasuke took notice of Saimata's hilt, which had several blue spikes shooting out of it to pierce Kisame's hand. Injecting its chakra directly into Kisame had been enough to snap him out of the imperfect Tsukiyomi. Sasuke looked up to the building where the 5 Kage were meeting without any warning of the organization of terrorists that were heading there at the moment. He had to warn them somehow, and he could only think of a few attacks big enough to get their attention. So he used one of them as Kisame ran at him to avenge Itachi. which was still a strange concept to him. He had never really thought that his murdering brother could actually become close enough to someone that they would want to avenge him, though it made sense that if he did, it would be a fellow monster like Kisame. Saimata was brought down hard on Sasuke, but it was stopped by glowing purple ribs. They cracked a bit, but repaired themselves as Susanoo roared to life with an explosion of purple chakra. The blast sent Kisame hurtling back, and he skidded to a stop to look up at the towering spectral warrior. It had taken a good deal of training, and he was still unable to clothe his Susanoo in armor like Itachi's. Still, his Susanoo loosed an arrow at Kisame, who barely had time to bring up Saimata and deflect it. Even then, the arrow pierced the ground barely a foot from where Kisame stood. "Good, it's only interesting when the prey fights back," said Kisame, a sick grin covering his face. Saimata's hilt bent like a snake and wound its way up Kisame's arm as it seemed to fuse with his skin. He held his hands up in a simple sign and reared his head back. Kisame's cheeks swelled to insane proportions before he opened his mouth and spat out a mind-staggering amount of water. Sasuke's Susanoo flailed uselessly in the watery dome as it was hit from all sides in quick succession. Kisame took a moment's pause to let Sasuke take in his new, even more shark-like form. "Water style, water prison shark dance. All that's left is to play with my food." The 5-cage summit had burst into a small uproar at the Raikage's possession of the last free Jinchuriki, and everyone present seemed insulted and furious, with the sole exception of the Raikage and his entourage. "What right do you have to the Seven Tails?" shouted the Tsuchikage, only raising his voice to be heard over the din. His question went unanswered in the general chaos of the moment however, and all the bodyguards present were tightening their grips on their weapons, ready to defend their leaders at a moment's notice. Enough. They were saved the trouble by Mifune, who had unsheathed his sword so quickly it created a large gust of wind. Before the bodyguards could react, the katana was resting once more in its sheath, and Mifune sat back down. "Now, while you are in my land, this will be an orderly and peaceable summit." He turned to face the Raikage. "Now, Lord Raikage, I will ask you what I'm sure we are all thinking. How did you come across the Seven Tails Jinchuriki?" The Raikage sighed in relief at the subsidence of yelling. "The Jinchuriki was brought to our village after the destruction of her own by a wandering ninja, who had apparently set out to protect her from Akatsuki, and only arrived just in the nick of time." Tsunade's eyes widened as a ninja that fit the description jumped to the front of her mind, vowing to stop Akatsuki with or without the hidden leaf. Her suspicions and fears were confirmed when the Raikage answered the Kazekage's query. "Who is this ninja?" "Sasuke Uchiha," said the Raikage calmly. Every ninja was aware of the last Uchiha, and the repercussions of one of the hidden leaf's founding clans potentially relocating to the hidden cloud. While one Uchiha wouldn't usually be a big deal, it became a big deal when the entire clan was comprised of one member. Kakashi in particular was rattled by his student's defection. It was clear that without Mifune's harsh gaze, the room would descend back into the clamor it had just left. In fact, no one could think of a way to voice an objection without making the problem worse. As the awkward silence dragged on for painful seconds, a messenger entered the room, bowing respectfully to Mifune. "Sir, there is a large sphere of water and large purple man trapped within outside." Before anyone else could react, the Mizukage and her sole bodyguard were on their feet. The other bodyguards leapt into action at the swordsman's action, and the banners fell to the floor. "Kisame Hoshigaki," said Chojuro, both terrified of fighting a living legend who had reportedly killed the previous Mizukage and impressed with himself for moving so quickly upon recognizing the threat. Tsunade was the next to speak up, standing up to be seen above Kakashi and Kenzo. "I think we all know that Akatsuki somehow knows that we have the last Jinchuriki, and they're coming for her," she said, gesturing to Fu, who was the only one still sitting in the balcony. Then the conversation was cut short as the roof exploded. Luckily, all the shrapnel had managed to hit all around Fu without even scratching the Jinchuriki herself. The Tsuchikage looked up at the white birds hovering above the newly created opening in shock. "Datara." Just then, the doors burst pen, and a soul samurai ran in, followed by a triple-bladed scythe that flew through the air behind him. It came down to impale him, but was stopped by Mifune's blade, which defended his samurai and sent the weapon flying back. "Damn it, I was going for a perfect record. Oh well. Kakuzu, how many did you get?" said Hidan as he caught his scythe out of midair and casually strolled into the room, along with the rest of Akatsuki. "They weren't worth anything, so I left the killing to you. The big game is at the top," said Kakuzu as Naruto leapt down to join the other Earthbound Akatsuki members. Konan and Datara continued to hover above the meeting room. Orochimaru, shouted Tsunade angrily. Her attention was diverted however, when Tenzo stabbed Kakashi in the back. "Tenzo, what are you doing?" "I guess the copy ninja isn't that great at spotting a copy, is he?" said Tenzo, as his skin slowly paled to a ghostly white. His brown hair also changed to a light green, and his clothes seemed to melt into an equally white skin. "It's been a while since I've gone undercover for so long, but that wood-style user really boosted my strength." The world leaders watched, suddenly cautious of their own bodyguards, as Zetsu jumped back to the group of Akatsuki, where a completely black version of him rose out of the ground, and they fused together. Tsunade knelt down to heal Kakashi, and he was up in seconds, though he was clearly still injured. Battlefield trauma was her forte after all. The Hokages stood by, ready to attack at a moment's notice, as Akatsuki parted to let a tall man with orange hair and numerous piercings walk forward. He fit the description of pain that Jiraiya had given, though Akatsuki's deference to him was a dead giveaway as to his status as Akatsuki's leader. "Akatsuki will be taking the Jinchuriki," he said matter-of-factly. "The only question is, how much pain will you suffer before we do?" The Hokage decided to try and swipe Pain's head off then and there, but he was stopped dead in his tracks and launched back the way he came just as quickly. A lot then. The Tsuchikage hadn't stuck around long after that. The oldest Kage had a score to settle, and sure enough, Deidara pursued him into the air. Once he had gotten high enough to ensure that he wouldn't accidentally vaporize the leaders of the world's most powerful countries by accident, he turned to face his wayward protege. "You know, all those times I had hired Akatsuki, I honestly didn't know you had joined them. By the time I found out, Akatsuki had stopped taking jobs. What can I say? World domination requires a good deal of our attention, yeah," replied Deidara. She tossed out a small clay figure, and jumped off of her current bird as it flew towards the Tsuchikage. Deidara was enveloped in a cloud of smoke as the clay beast was trapped within a transparent cube. The white clay hawk tried to explode, but was atomized by Anaki's feared dust. "Style." The floating man looked at Deidara's latest piece emerged from the smoke that had obscured it. A large clay serpent coiled around in the sky, suspended by large clay wings. Deidara stood atop the head of the long and skinny dragon with a smile on her face. "Well, old man, is this a waste of time?" The serpentine dragon flew through the air gracefully, dodging the cube that came threatened to vaporize it, and fired a smaller dragon out of its mouth as its tail grew shorter. The dragon flew at the Tsuchikage, who deftly flew out of the way. He was unprepared however, when the dragon swooped around to follow him, even as Deidara launched another. Stuck between the two, Anaki stopped mid-air and slammed his hands together. The dragons exploded upon contact, but when the smoke cleared, the Tsuchikage was unharmed, covered by a smoking layer of solid rock. Deidara glared at the old man as his golem armor fell off. Her C2 dragon lost another segment of its tail as it pulled back its mighty wings. Small bits began to bulge from the clay creation, and they came flying out as a hail of clay insects when the dragon flapped its wings toward the Tsuchikage. Looking onward at the mass of exploding insects propelled toward him by a large gust of wind, Anaki's eyes narrowed as he clapped his hands together. When he opened them, he held a glowing rectangle between his hands that was incredibly thin. As he launched it forward, his dust style grew to enormous proportions and turned all of the miniature bombs into dust as they tried to pass through. It wasn't aerodynamic enough to cross the distance required to hit Deidara and end the fight though. "I would have taught you the dust style, you know," he shouted across the gap to his former successor. "Just as Mu taught it to me. You were to be the Tsuchikage after me. And then you betrayed my trust. Oh shove it, yeah. My art is all I need. And it's 100, no, 1,000 times better than your pathetic dust style." Deidara lowered her hand into her clay pouch and began to chew on the white sculpting material as her dragon launched a particularly fat and fast dragon from its mouth. "Such a shame to waste your potential," muttered the Tsuchikage, before raising his head to glare at Deidara. "But I'll end it here." Light and boulder technique. His weight decreased even further by the same technique that enabled him to fly. Anaki shot forward, faster than the smaller dragon could react. With his increased speed, he delivered a punch to send his former student hurtling to the ground below. However, Deidara's left hand came up and caught his wrist as his fist touched her abdomen. The renegade bomber however, remained unmoved by his punch. "Wow, you might hit fast, but you lose the force behind your punches too, yeah. It might not have been a big deal when you were young enough to still hit hard, but now you're just a feeble old man." The mouth on Deidara's right hand opened up and spat out a small bat, ready to explode. Reacting quickly, the Tsuchikage lowered his other hand to touch the massive dragon's head. Weighted boulder technique. Its weight increased several hundredfold. The massive clay dragon fell to the ground like a ton of bricks, leaving the bat to detonate uselessly several hundred feet above them. Her visible eye widening in shock, Deidara released the Tsuchikage and jumped off her falling creation at the last second. She knew the old man had to keep contact with the target, and quickly detonated the large dragon. The explosion large enough to damage the meeting hall, but if it meant killing the Tsuchikage, she didn't care. You know, replacing myself with a rock clone on such short notice like that is bad for my back. Deidara whirled around to see the Tsuchikage hovering behind her, one hand resting on his lower back. With a glare, the two resumed their exploding aerial dance, and Deidara wondered idly if she had at least destroyed the Kazekage's stupid hat. The fighting had been rather small scale in the beginning, as either side breaking out big attacks would result in friendly fire. In that regard, Deidara Dragon blowing up a good portion of the building was a blessing in disguise for both sides. It separated them all into smaller groups, where they could more safely use their better techniques. "You remind me of the first leaf ninja I ever fought," said Kakuzu, glaring at the voluptuous Hokage in front of him. "Well, let me show you what a competent leaf ninja can do to an enemy of her village," said Tsunade, cracking her neck. She was a bit surprised by the masked Akatsuki member's angry response to her words. "You won't even hold a candle to his strength," he said angrily. "I might even indulge in Hidan's favorite pastime here. I'm not sure I can resist the chance to end his entire clan." "Wait, who was this ninja you fought?" asked Tsunade, ready to attack the moment he confirmed or denied her suspicions. "Of course he wouldn't mention me," said Kakuzu, his voice dripping with spite and sarcasm. "After I lost to the first Hokage, I was banished from my village. I stole the Earth Grudge Fear before I left and exacted my revenge on those who had wronged me, but your grandfather, the man who ruined my life, was always too strong. So I'll have to settle for killing his useless excuse of a granddaughter." Tsunade roared in anger as she ran at Kakuzu, fist reared back to send him flying to the hidden sand village. To his credit, Kakuzu simply stood there as his skin darkened. The punch collided, and Kakuzu doubled over in pain as he felt several ribs break, gasping at the force of the blow. Perhaps Tsunade wasn't quite weaker than the first Hokage had been. Still, his Earth Spear technique absorbed most of the force, and he was conscious enough to have one of his hearts fire a blast of wind through his Akatsuki cloak to hit the fifth Hokage in the head. Tsunade was sent hurtling back by the blast, and the wind shredded her face. Kakuzu stood up, placing a hand on his wounded stomach, and looked for the now headless granddaughter of his most hated enemy. And Tsunade looked back, unchanged save for the tattoo spreading out across her body from the former location of the diamond mark on her forehead. "I might not be my grandfather, and it's true that I can't use the wood style. But I am still the Hokage, and I refuse to be underestimated." Kakuzu decided to stop underestimating his foe as he discarded his damaged Akatsuki cloak. Grunting in pain as his 4 extra hearts tore their way out of his back, Kakuzu regained his composure once his back finished stitching itself back together. "Very well then," he said gruffly through his mask. "If you can heal, let's just see how much you can heal at a time." The mouths behind him opened with a loud crack and launched their powerful elements. Tsunade dropped her foot to kick up a wall of stone that used to be a part of the floor to block the attack, and it worked for a second. Then the overwhelming strength of the combined attacks tore the simple rock to pieces. When the blast died down, Kakuzu's eyes widened when he saw Tsunade running at him, flesh only halfway done healing itself. He ducked under the punch, but was given a kick in the face for his trouble. If it weren't for his skill in reattaching limbs, the fight would have been over right then and there. As it was, several threads shot out of his neck to catch his severed head and reattach it to his torso. Tsunade was having none of it, and grabbed the threads with both hands. Using Kakuzu like a mace, she swung his body around, nailing his fire heart. It was a testament to her strength that the blunt force trauma was enough to crush the heart behind the mask. Kakuzu's lightning, wind, and water hearts flew upwards to dodge the body-turned weapon. Firing a beam of lightning at the Hokage to get her to release Kakuzu proved incredibly ineffective. The first female Kage used Kakuzu's body as a shield, and his earth heart took the attack instead, getting destroyed in the process. She did let go of the body though, as the beam showed no signs of stopping. Granted, her drop-kicking the wind heart was less than ideal, but by the time she had regained her footing on the shattered floor, Kakuzu's final 2 hearts had re-entered his body. If Kakuzu had been less prideful, he would have readily admitted his mistake in comparing the woman before him to her grandfather. He would fight, not a medic or a woman, but an S-rank threat. Deciding then and there that he wouldn't let his emotions come into play from here on out, Kakuzu cracked his neck, which now connected his body and head. "Kakuzu, the Akatsuki member with 5 hearts," said Tsunade, staring down the man she had just identified. "You killed ninja under my command. I can't bring them back. I'm the best medic in the world, but even I'm not that good of a medic. But you'll find that the people best able to keep you out of the afterlife are the people best able to send you there as well. And if I have to kill you 5 times? Well, that's just more therapy for me." Chojuro was quite proud of himself. Through all the chaos and explosions, he had managed to stay by the Mizukage's side. Mei Terumi had entrusted him with her safety, and he would be damned before he let her face a member of Akatsuki alone. Still, he had been hoping for an Akatsuki member with a little less terrifying reputation. As if sensing the boy's thoughts, Orochimaru's freakishly long tongue snuck its way out of his mouth and slowly licked his lips. Chojuro shuddered at the man's actions, and the 3 men on around him didn't fill the only legal member of the 7 ninja swordsmen of the Hidden Mist with confidence either. He stopped shaking when he felt the Mizukage's reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Chojuro, I can handle myself against this snake. You just handle his little worms. I know you can handle this." Chojuro gulped, but steeled himself for combat with the 2 stoic-looking ninja, and the 1 ninja who looked ready to kill for the legendary sword in Chojuro's hands. "Kimimaro, Suigetsu, Ju-Ugo," said Orochimaru, addressing his 3 followers. "You handle the guppy. I'll take care of the big fish." The white-haired one, apparently named Kimimaro, nodded silently. The massive orange-haired giant next to him seemed more resigned than eager to fight, but his lack of enthusiasm was countered by the shortest ninja's barely checked fervor. Chojuro was honestly surprised that this Suigetsu had contained himself this long. Chojuro was taken aback when Kimimaro removed his shirt, letting it fall around his waist. The reason became clear when a long, white sword rose out from under his skin. Chojuro's confidence actually swelled a bit before he realized what that meant. In a sword fight, he wouldn't be beaten by anyone. He was the current leader of the other members of the 7 Swordsmen of the Mist. Then he recalled where he had heard of these abilities before. The Kaguya Revolt had been a rallying point for the 4th Mizukage's followers after he had adopted an anti-bloodline stance. While the event's political implications were terrible for the cause, Mei had agreed with the actions themselves. The warlike clan was dangerous, and far too bloodthirsty to operate in any civilized society. And now one of them that had somehow survived the eradication of the Kaguya clan was standing right in front of Chojuro, holding a sword made out of his own bone in his hand. Sighing in an attempt to calm his frantically beating heart, Chojuro pulsed his chakra through Haramkare and the bandages wrapped around the sword exploded off of the steel in a burst of chakra. Suigetsu's eyes lit up at sight of the sword, and despite the Kaguya's inherent advantage with his bloodline, only one to really seem eager about the fighting was the first to charge at Chojuro. In disbelief of the simple, idiotic attack, Chojuro swung his sword down, and the chakra emitted from the 2 holes at the tip of the massive sword took the form of an even more massive hammer. Chojuro saw the ninja in front of him turn into water right as the hammer crushed him into the floor. The bespectacled ninja was an experienced ninja from the Hidden Mist, and immediately identified the crushed person as a water clone and was immediately on guard. It saved his life, when he was able to block the small pellets that Kimimaro had launched at him from his fingertips. Changing the chakra around his sword into a massive fly swatter, he did one better than simply blocking the projectiles, sending them straight back. The 10 fingertip bones were stopped by a wall of water that rose up from the puddle that had been the water clone and absorbed the bullets of bone. The clone then reformed, wearing a fearsome grin with sharpened teeth. Opening his mouth, Suigetsu spit the bits of bone out, which was something water clones couldn't do. Jumping away as Suigetsu smashed the ground where he had been standing with a strangely proportioned fist, Chojuro was forced to re-evaluate his opponents. Kimimaro was clearly a Kaguya, which meant he had a unique control over his skeleton. It could supposedly harden to become stronger than the strongest armor, or form nearly indestructible weapons. If Suigetsu's ability was what Chojuro thought it was, he was the same little brother of Mangetsu Hozuki. Which meant that his older brother had been the previous owner of the same sword Chojuro now wielded. Fighting an opponent who could transform into water at will would be difficult, but he had a plan of sorts. The only unknown was the hulking orange-haired man who had remained silent until now. Kimimaro turned to his companion. "He is skilled. If you do not fight, I might have to push myself too far to defeat him." Looking down at the last Kaguya, Ju-Ugo responded calmly. "Then don't," he said simply. "My devotion to Lord Orochimaru is absolute. I will win here, no matter the cost. And I cannot count on Suigetsu to watch my back. Can I count on you?" Suigetsu was indeed doing a wretched job of watching Kimimara's back, charging recklessly at Chojuro, reforming from the splatters of water whenever Chojuro cut him in half. Juugo sighed in resignation. "Very well then," he said, as flaming red marks crawled across his skin, slowly covering his whole body. Whatever Juugo could do, Chojuro had a feeling he would find out soon. "You know, it isn't nice to take advantage of our friendship like that. Kind of makes me mad. No, furious is the right word. And when I get furious, I just want to kill things." Grinning as his friend's bloodthirsty alternate personality slowly surfaced, Kimimaro pointed to Chojuro, who was still trying to keep his distance from the watery Hozuki who wanted his sword. "Then kill him." A mad grin spread across Juugo's face as the red marks faded to a light gray. His eyes now a deranged-looking black and gold, Juugo began to laugh maniacally. "I'm going to kill you," he shouted as he ran towards Chojuro, sped up by the chakra jets affixed to his back. Bringing up Haramkare to block the punch, Chojuro was nevertheless sent hurtling along the ground from the sheer power behind Juugo's hit. Skidding to a stop, he was barely able to get Haramkare in time to block Kimimaro's straight stab. The bone sword was impressive, and almost got through the hole in the legendary sword's dip to hit Chojuro. Twisting his sword to dislodge the bone blade from Kimimaro's hand, Chojuro kicked out to nail Suigetsu in mid-air. A bone sprung out of Kimimaro's other palm and he thrust it toward Chojuro's prone form. Suigetsu reformed and grabbed a hold of Chojuro's ankle, which was still stuck in Suigetsu's stomach. In his rage though, Juugo smashed down on Chojuro at that same moment. The explosion or debris in floor tiles was actually enough to send Chojuro through the floor to the level below. When the dust cleared, Chojuro stood, still shaking, holding a dented Haramkare above his head. Juugo, Kimimaro, and Suigetsu jumped down to surround him, and Chojuro hoped that Lady Mizukage was having better luck than he was. Orochimaru stood facing the Mizukage, who stared back unafraid. "Sorry, but you're not really my type, a tad too old for my tastes," said Mei, a small grin tugging at her lips. "Kukaku," laughed Orochimaru, as he licked his lips. "I'm afraid you'll have to put up with me for a bit longer. Strength, chakra reserves, and 2 bloodlines, what more could I ask for in a body?" Not waiting to see what the rogue Sannin was talking about, Mei began to run through hand seals. Water style, hyper cutter. Mei spit out a super concentrated stream of water that could cut through steel. Orochimaru dodged the blast of water by slithering along the ground on his stomach like the snakes he summoned. Cutting off her stream of water when it became clear that Orochimaru wasn't going to get hit so easily. The moment the water stopped, Orochimaru turned to slither towards the Mizukage. Hidden shadow snake hands. Orochimaru lifted his hand, and several large pythons shot out of his sleeves to wrap themselves around the Mizukage. The speed of the attack took her by surprise, though it made sense considering the former Leaf Ninja's legendary status. Orochimaru's legs reformed from the more snake-like blur as he aimed to a stop in front of her. "Now then, your body is mine." Smirking seductively, the Mizukage breathed out a fine mist of acid. Orochimaru's skin began to melt off his body, and the same happened to the snakes wrapped around her. Jumping away from the Sannin, who was screaming in pain as his body melted, she grinned in victory. "I'm sorry, I'm simply not into older men." She turned away to go help Chojuro with his own fight, but whirled around when Orochimaru's screaming turned to laughter. The mouth on the Akatsuki member's deformed face opened wide, and another body crawled out, without so much as a scratch. "You won't be rid of me that easily. I won't take no for an answer. Your body will be mine." Lava release, lava globs. Mei spat out several globules of lava at Orochimaru, who ran through his own hand seals. Wind style, great breakthrough. The massive blast of wind that Orochimaru shot out of his palm was enough to turn the lava balls into minuscule bits of hot rock that cooled into a rain of pebbles by the time they landed around Orochimaru. Grinning insanely, the snake summoner launched another blast of blunt air at the Mizukage. It sent her flying back towards the wall. Twisting around mid-air, the Mizukage sprung off of the wall to shoot towards the pale-skinned Sannin. Water style, water dragon bullet. Using her own velocity to make the water dragon even faster, the Mizukage's technique bore down on Orochimaru. A cloud of smoke enveloped him before the water could crash over the snake summoner. When the water collided with the Sannin and dispersed the smoke, Orochimaru had been replaced by a large purple snake. The snake opened its mouth to hiss at the Mizukage, and the rogue Sannin stepped out of the fanged reptile's mouth. "You'll need to try harder than that if you want to beat me, or you could just give up." Kukaku. "Hello." Tamari swung her fan once more, chopping the Snow White Akatsuki member into tiny pieces with blades of wind sharp enough to cut steel. It was ultimately useless though, as more clones rose up from the ground, all of them wearing a completely ridiculous grin. "Will you just stay dead?" shouted Tamari as she smashed a Zetsu clone upside the head with her war fan. Folded up, the wind-creating fan made an incredibly effective club, something Tamari used to great effect whenever a Zetsu clone got too close. Ebizo was holding his own against the horde of white, using a fishing pole of all things to keep the clones at bay. Oddly enough, the clones of Zetsu were treating it like a deadly weapon and keeping their distance. The ability to produce clones on this scale is an impressive ability, but I doubt it is enough to make him an S-rank ninja, said Ebizo, as he wielded his fishing pole as a rapier to smack several Zetsu clones. Oddly enough, as soon as the flexible bit of wood hit them, the clones stopped whatever they were doing and stood completely still. It was the genjutsu touch that had made Ebizo feared during the war as one of the premier genjutsu experts in the world. One touch was enough to trap his opponent in a false world, often with no idea that they had been placed under a genjutsu. We need to be on guard for his true power. Tamari swung her fan, cutting down the entranced Zetsu clones like blades of grass, as she grunted in agreement. If he can do anything else, he certainly isn't in any hurry to do anything with it. True enough, ever since Zetsu had separated them from Gaara in the explosion, he had done little but send clones of himself en masse. As soon as she turned around to kill the clones that Ebizo had incapacitated though, a white Zetsu clone jumped out of the ground from behind her and wrapped large white spines around her. Tamari could feel her chakra being drained by the white Zetsu clone as she struggled to get away. Luckily, Ebizo noticed, and sent Zetsu stumbling away in a genjutsu-induced stupor. "Thanks," said Tamari before returning the favor by smashing in a Zetsu's face over Ebizo's shoulder. This clone was different however, and exploded in a cloud of smoke. With all the Zetsu clones around, this was a debilitating problem. Luckily, one did not live over 80 years in the land of wind without learning some wind-style techniques. Wind-style, smoke clearing. The particular technique Ebizo used was specifically designed to blow away smoke from smoke bombs. It wouldn't knock over a teacup, let alone harm an opponent, but it used up next to no chakra. Looking around frantically as he removed the cognitive functions of several Zetsu clones who had tried to get in close and looked around for Tamari, worried that she had been taken out while the smoke was up. Ebizo was surprised for a moment when he saw two copies of Tamari facing off against each other with the war fan stuck into the ground between them. For a moment he wondered how to tell which one was the real one, before his decades of experience with the chakra system kicked in automatically. Concentrating on the chakra system of the Kage's sister, Ebizo's eyes widened in shock. "Impossible. Your chakra? It's exactly the same." This news took Tamari off guard, though both copies reacted the exact same way. "Damn it, you'll need to ask me something only the real me would know," shouted both versions of Tamari in unison. Luckily for Ebizo, the other copies of Zetsu seemed to be content to watch the drama in front of them unfold, giving him time to concoct a plan to tell the real Tamari from the transformed Zetsu. "Very well then, what was the name of your older brother?" asked Ebizo calmly. He noticed as one of the two copies of Tamari tightened her fists in anguish, but the other one turned to him in anger. "My older brother was Kankuro. His death is the reason I want to get revenge on Akatsuki." The other copy of Tamari looked at Ebizo in horror as he slowly turned to her. "Wait, Ebizo. They must have stolen that information with a spy, or something," she pleaded, holding up her hands as the elderly ninja whipped out his fishing pole. "You have to believe me, he's the imposter." Ebizo brought up his fishing pole, prepared to send the obvious fake into a genjutsu. The fishing pole shot out to the side, the line flying out and digging into the other Tamari's neck. One sharp tug later, and the Tamari that had answered his question stumbled towards him in shock and received a sharp tap on the forehead to activate the genjutsu. "You could never talk about a sibling's death so casually," explained Ebizo calmly as the real Tamari regained her composure. "If you were able to, I wouldn't want to fight alongside you anyway. Now then, we should clear this up and protect the Kage. Genjutsu, Field of Flames." Nothing seemed to happen for the second after Ebizo completed his hand seals, save for the Zetsu clones drawing closer now that their ploy had failed. Then they all collapsed on the ground, writhing in pain as their bodies were burned away by imaginary fires. Tamari retrieved her fan and drew a bloody thumb across the durable fabric. In a puff of smoke, a scythe-wielding weasel with an eye patch appeared alongside a glowing blue lantern. A swing of her war fan sent the weasel flying around the room, chopping the Zetsu army to pieces. Tamari was a bit winded by the chakra cost of summoning, which is why she hadn't used the technique at the beginning of the fight. However, anything was worth the cost if it meant protecting her younger brother. Well well well. Ebizo and Tamari looked up to the ceiling as a deep voice resounded through the chamber. It appears your little army ploy failed spectacularly. I guess I'll handle this. Fine, we'll do this the old-fashioned way. The two-toned man half-fused with the ceiling berated himself before shooting several wooden spikes out of the ceiling around him in an attempt to impale the sand ninja below him. As Kazekage, I won't allow myself to lose again, said Gaara as he faced down the hunched-over Akatsuki member before him. The man's face was obscured by a thick bandana, but the voice was obviously distorted by something. I've heard it all before. He responded in a deep voice. The third said something similar before I killed him. And I imagine that your own father would have done the same if I had taken a more direct approach with him. As it was, the third Hokage got to him before my poison could do its job, but the end result was the same. Gaara's ringed eyes narrowed at the Akatsuki member's words. What interest do you have in the Kazekage? I am Sasori of the Red Sand, famed puppeteer of the village you now rule over. I am the killer of the third Kazekage, who has joined my collection. Sasori's hand slowly reached up to his mouth to uncover a demented segmented grin. The bits of the mouth moved separately, and the eerie clacking noise would have made anyone less stoic than Gaara shudder. And I had plans to add the fourth Kazekage to my collection. His foolish invasion of the hidden leaf saved me time, though I was lucky to get a hold of the body in time. Now you will be my third Kazekage. Gaara's hand moved instinctively to stop the barrage of senbon that emerged from Sasori's mouth. The sand became so saturated with senbon that by the end of the bombardment, the needles were bouncing off of themselves rather than being caught in the sand. One large pulse of the wall of sand sent the senbon hurtling back at Sasori, albeit with a much lower standard of accuracy. The Akatsuki member simply stood there as the needles embedded themselves into his cloak. Sasori seemed to not notice his new resemblance to a pincushion, and Gaara was almost afraid of the answer for what he was about to ask. What is this collection? I am a puppeteer, said Sasori simply as he raised his left arm. The large cylinder detached itself from the rest of his arm and flew towards Gaara. Sand reached out to grab the projectile, and succeeded. The smaller cylinders embedded inside the large hand substitute shot out in a burst of pressure. It would have likely been difficult to dodge the canisters full of senbon, but they were effectively contained by the Kazekage's sand. For your crimes against the village hidden in the sand, I, the fifth Kazekage, will be your executioner. With that said, Gaara's sand shot forward in a massive wave as the Kazekage rose his arms as if beckoning it forth. Sasori was many things, but puppeteers were not very mobile as a general rule of thumb, and there was no way he could simply dodge the enormous wave of sand even if he had placed more effort into the art of dodging. The tsunami of sand formed a large dome around Sasori, before compacting into a small ball around half the size. The sand fell away to reveal Sasori's body, which was surprisingly not a mangled ball of blood and bones. The bloodless body fell to the ground practically unscathed, yet still unmoving. Gaara was wary of any tricks, and his agitated sand whirled around him protectively. There was a blur of motion, and a cloaked figure emerged from inside the motionless Akatsuki member. Standing up, the figure cast of the cloak to reveal a young man with hair as red as Gaara's wearing an Akatsuki cloak. I suppose that technique could just as easily be turned against me. And now we can stop wasting time with meaningless trickery, he said as two scrolls fell into his hands from inside his sleeves. Holding one up in each hand, Sasori's real body slowly unrolled the two scrolls to reveal the numbers 3 and 4 written in kanji. There were two clouds of smoke that quickly cleared to reveal Sasori flanked by two robed figures. One had black hair, and the other had red hair cut short like both Gaara and Sasori. Gaara couldn't contain his shock as he recognized the two puppets. One he knew through association only. He had attended many meetings under the stony gaze of the third Kazekage's statue. It was surprising to see a puppet in the visage of the great leader of the hidden sand village, but the second puppet hit him much harder. While he had only been told about the exploits of the third Kazekage, he had been raised by the fourth Kazekage. Even if it was just a puppet, the resemblance was uncanny. You think you can unnerve me with these pathetic facsimiles? Your puppets have no chance against a true Kazekage. Sasori's laugh stopped Gaara from launching his sand to crush the Akatsuki's resident puppeteer in an explosion of blood. You think I've simply made copies of the previous Kazekage? They never recovered the third's body, and I think you'll find the fourth's body suspiciously missing. This the ultimate achievement of my art. Human puppets are much harder to create, but the rewards are well worth it. To make his point, the mouths of the two Kazekage snapped open as a compartment on their chests opened to pulse out waves of magnetism. A wave of Gaara's sand rushed out to meet the attack of the Akatsuki's puppets. Despite the amount of sand towering over all of the combatants, it was met grain for grain by a wave of golden sand. The amount was the same, though the greater weight of the gold allowed it to overwhelm the 5th Kazekage's sand tsunami. Black sand, 10-foot spikes. Gaara's sand reacted instinctively to the attack from above, and while it didn't stop the massive shapes made of iron sand, his ultimate defense did slow the 3rd Kazekage's attack long enough for Gaara to jump out of the way. Gaara realized then that the puppets of his two predecessors still had access to their abilities, something that Kankuro had told him was impossible. Sasori brought his hand up in a unique seal to launch his next attack, determined not to give his latest target a moment's peace. Thousand-hand manipulation force. The 3rd Kazekage raised his left arm in the sides open menacingly to reveal the seal matrices inscribed on the insides. Near identical copies of the Kazekage's arm burst out of the seals, which in turn opened up to produce even more arms. Soon a wall of wooden hands was hurtling towards Gaara, who raised his sand to catch the attack. The hands wove around the sand, or attempted to anyway, as a blue-veined hand reached out and grabbed a hold of the arms. That didn't stop one of the hands from retracting into the arm to make an opening for a deadly purple mist to rain down on the Kazekage. His sand reacted quickly, but the poison was already around Gaara, who was holding his breath and sensing the world through his sand rather than risk opening his eyes. Not wanting to open his mouth and utter the name of a technique, Gaara simply sent his sand into a frenzied sandstorm to scour the poison from the air. Cables shot out of the massive hands as it flew through the air, and wrapped themselves around his shield of sand. The 3rd Kazekage popped off his arm at the elbow, detaching the massive wooden hands. Sasori's hands snapped together in another unique seal that did nothing but command his puppets. Golden sand, treasure drop. Gaara looked up at the massive sphere of golden sand that began to fall on top of him. Gaara's sand formed a thick dome over him, as he was currently held in place by his own sand, which refused to move to keep the cables from tightening around him. The golden dust weighed down on the sand dome, which held up admirably under the pressure. Gaara used the room around himself and the time his defenses bought to grind the floor beneath him to sand and escape. Still obscured from Sasori, Gaara sensed his sand cave in under the weight and velocity of the golden sphere and crush where he had been. Bursting from the ground in a flurry of sand, Gaara enveloped the two Kazekage puppets in coffins of sand. Crushing them did little to actually kill them, but it did freeze up all the joints of the puppets, turning them into useless hunks of wood, flesh, and metal. Sasori sighed heavily as his puppets failed to respond. "I suppose this is what I get for letting my guard down." "Give up now, Sasori," said Gaara, glaring at his village's pioneering puppeteer. He had no plans of sparing the murdering puppeteer, but if he stood still, Gaara would have a much easier time killing him. "You're all out of puppets, and I've beaten your favorites. There are actually 2 puppets in my collection I adore more, though they're more sentimental than combat-oriented," said Sasori as he slowly unbuttoned his Akatsuki cloak, not turning to face the Kazekage who was glaring at his back. "And the Kazekage weren't my best works. I don't make puppets, I make art. Art is eternal, and guess what? So am I." Sasori wheeled around, and concentrated jets of water shot out of his palms. Gaara's sand was barely fast enough to get between him and the attack, and his ultimate defense began to sag under its own weight as it took on water. The water gave up after a moment, and Gaara got a good look at the monster, for there was no more mistaking Sasori as human, before him. Sasori had looked unnaturally young, and now it made sense. He stood on a thick cable that emerged from where his stomach was supposed to be as blade-like wings fanned out behind him. The lines where his joints held him together were all too apparent without the Akatsuki cloak covering him up. Small gray tubes in his palms still dripped water, and Gaara could see 2 compartments in his chest, one adorned with the kanji for scorpion painted on in red. "So you see now?" asked Sasori mockingly. "Art is eternal beauty, and my greatest masterpiece is me." Fu had spent the first part of the fight in the meeting chamber trying not to be noticed. The moment the ceiling had exploded, she had taken to the skies in attempt to escape. She made it a fair distance from the chaos before she looked back. "Looks like my luck holds once more," she mused to herself. Looking away from the explosions and giant geometry lessons, Fu saw one thing she had no desire to see again hovering mere feet in front of her. Suspended by angelic wings of paper, Konan stared impassively as the Jinchuriki backpedaled in mid-air. "You are needed to usher in an era of peace led by God himself. You can die in peace, knowing you brought about a greater good for all, or die in agony, knowing you failed to escape. Fu smirked victoriously. How about I escape, laughing in the knowledge I gave you the slip? Hiding in scale powder. A stream of blinding powder was propelled out of Fu's mouth, effectively blinding her opponent as the Jinchuriki of the Seven Tails made her escape. There was a resounding explosion behind her, and the blinding dust was blasted away from where Konan had been. Fu put on a burst of speed to get further away from the battleground. She wasn't stupid though. Fu looked around frantically for the Akatsuki member, refusing to believe that she had blown herself up because Fu blinded her temporarily. Looking up, Fu barely had time to dodge the hail of paper shuriken. Every kid who had ever played ninja knew how to make paper shuriken, but Fu somehow knew that these would be far more lethal than their schoolyard counterparts. Konan swooped down at her target, more gracefully than Fu would like to admit, and made to envelop her with the paper wings. The Seven Tails had one thing going for it though, and that was speed and maneuverability. Fu's fat-speeding wings enabled her to avoid being trapped, and Fu realized that she wouldn't be able to simply get lucky and escape this time. Wincing as she drew on more of her tailed beast's chakra, Fu grew a long tail that whipped out to hit Konan in the face. Any doubts about where the explosion had come from faded when the section of Konan's face Fu had struck peeled off. Noticing the ceiling matrices inscribed on the notes, Fu desperately tried to get them off of her tail. It was in vain though, when the bombs went off anyway. To seal the deal, Konan sent a wave of paper shuriken into the smoke, only to hear them bounce off of some kind of armor harmlessly. The smoke cleared to reveal that Fu had become obscured by a thick blue armor, reminiscent of the beetle sealed inside her. It was one thing to draw on a tailed beast's chakra, but to cover your entire body in it was a burning experience comparable only to being burned alive forever. Fu had no illusions that she could keep up her armor indefinitely, but it was infinitely better than exploding. Konan glared at the Jinchuriki who dared defy her. Exploding into paper slips as a long tail whipped through her, Konan transformed into hundreds of origami butterflies before reforming behind Fu. Raising her hand high, the paper around Konan ceased fluttering about and came together into a massive spear. The armor that encapsulated Fu wasn't weak, and the paper weapon glanced right off, even though Konan had hardened the paper to be stronger than steel. Still, they both knew that the armor was a temporary advantage. Once the beetle's carapace became too painful to hold up, Fu would be a sitting duck. Pushing her advantage, Fu charged Konan angrily. Konan gracefully dodged, and ducked under the tail that swiped past. She didn't see the tail reverse direction though, and was sent reeling by the blow that connected to the back of her head. Konan wheeled around to see Fu flit around, having ditched the armor for additional speed. Konan was smacked once more, and she gritted her teeth as she tried to track down any pattern to Fu's movements. Konan failed miserably as Fu smacked her around again and again. Each hit wasn't much more powerful than a punch from a Jinan, and it was clear that the Jinchuriki was sacrificing power for speed and mobility. The blue-haired Akatsuki member burst into paper to avoid another blow, and was quick to reform away from where Fu continued to batter her paper clone. A large mass of chakra formed into a ring above her head, reminiscent of a halo, and was quickly launched at the Jinchuriki. Fu noticed her mistake, and dodged out of the way. Even so, the chakram of paper left a nasty gash across the Jinchuriki's chest. Demonic chakra bubbled around the wound and burned it shut, but the pain was evident on Fu's face. The pain was so intense that Fu apparently lost track of Konan's paper clone. Bumping into the clone, Fu panicked as it wrapped her in a tight grip of paper. The chakra meanwhile, turned around in the air and hurtled towards the seized Jinchuriki. While the technique could have easily cut her in half, a wound not even a Jinchuriki could recover from, pain would kill Konan, childhood friend or not, if she delayed the plan for 7 years when it had just entered its final stages. So instead, the paper weapon fell apart as it got closer and helped restrain the Jinchuriki. Konan made a single seal to activate the seals on the tags used to make the chakram. Archaic writing crisscrossed the paper mummy in seconds, sealing it from anything less powerful than a tailed beast ball. The paper floated to Konan, who began the long trek back to the leader of Akatsuki. She hadn't noticed at the time, but the Jinchuriki had managed to place quite some distance between Akatsuki and herself. Storm style, laser circus. Multiple beams of light flew out of Daru's hands toward their target. The lasers could travel at incredible speed, change direction as they read Daru's will, and had a near limitless range. All in all, they were the epitome of skill. Naruto smirked as he decided to show Daru the difference between the two of them. Skill was one thing, But Akatsuki specialized in fighting tailed beasts, a task that required overwhelming power. Sage Art, Gale Force. The lasers faltered in the face of the powerful winds that tore up pieces of the floor. Even the strongest of the lasers faded to nothingness several feet from the blonde Akatsuki member. Unfortunately for Naruto, there was one other ninja present who dealt in overwhelming force. Lariat. Naruto sensed the movement of the fourth Raikage, and he would have had to have deaf to miss the shouting. But the Raikage's lightning armor increased speed as well as attack and defensive strength. Naruto ducked, but was unable to fully avoid the attack, and the Raikage's metal vambraces grazed his forehead. Granted, a grazing blow was still enough to send the sage flying across the room. Naruto skidded to a stop, but looked up just in time to see the Raikage's fist hurtling towards his face. Perhaps mentioning his hand in the ceiling of Killer Bee had been a bad idea. The blow connected, but Naruto was slightly ready for it, and enacted his own counterattack in the moment when the Raikage was standing still. Grabbing onto the edge of the Raikage's vambrace with one hand, Naruto pulled himself forward, delivering his own punch to the Raikage's face. The muscle-bound cage was sent soaring towards his bodyguard. Naruto jumped into the air, intent on trying to end it there, but Daru fulfilled his role as the Raikage's protector. Water Style, Tidal Drive. The burst of water from Daru's mouth was strong enough to stop Naruto's forward momentum, but the stalwart sage bore the brunt of the attack easily as the Raikage rose to his feet. Calmly placing one hand into the water, the Raikage sent a massive shock through the water towards Naruto. The Akatsuki member released the grip his chakra had on the ground, allowing the water to push him away from the charged current. He hit the wall hard, but Naruto barely felt it through Sage Mode, instead flipping up the wall before the lightning could electrocute him. The Raikage barely missed Naruto as he punched at the Akatsuki member and smashed the wall where he had been into 1,000 little pieces. Naruto detached from the wall, using gravity add force to his attack. Running through several seals as quickly as he could as the Raikage attempted to remove his hand from the wall, Naruto gathered wind chakra around his fist. Hoping to use the element's advantage against lightning to break through the powerful lightning armor that empowered the Raikage. Sage Art, Whirlwind Fist. It was a testament to the defensive aspect of the lightning armor that a Sage Mode powered technique with an elemental advantage didn't punch all the way through the Raikage's chest. As it was, the wound was nothing to scoff at, and Naruto's hand was covered in blood when he was knocked away by Daru's laser circus. "Lord Raikage, are you okay?" asked Daru in concern as the Raikage returned to his bodyguard's side to regroup. "I'm fine," replied the Raikage, as he cauterized his own wound with a handful of lightning. He glared at Naruto, who was catching his breath and trying not to rub at the bruises forming all over his body. Naruto was certain that if he could survive this last raid and Akatsuki captured the last Jinchuriki, he would be in the clear. Unfortunately, survival was still up in the air. "Any last words before I offer you two to Jashin?" asked Hidan amicably. He thought he was being a pretty nice guy, letting them get in some last words before they were sacrificed to his god. Hidan didn't think he had been rude enough to justify getting punched into the wall by a rock golem. "That fucking hurt, you fat bastard. No more Mr. Nice Guy." "Oh, shut up, will you?" Lava Style, Fiery Quicklime. Kurotsuchi spat out a blob of gray quicklime that landed on top of Hidan, who began to shout as the hot substance began to burn him. "That burns, bitch. I'll fucking sacrifice you for that." He scraped the substance off of his skin with the blade of his scythe, a method that wound up removing a fair bit of his skin as well, and then swung his scythe experimentally to see if his arms still worked. Grinning maniacally, Hidan threw his scythe at the Tsuchikige's bodyguards, guiding it through the air with the cable that ran from the scythe into the sleeve of his Akatsuki cloak. A small black cylinder fell into his other hand, and a flick of his wrist extended the weapon into a long spike. Armed for close-range combat, Hidan ran towards the two hidden rock ninja who were busy dealing with his scythe's random movements. The giant rock golem that the fat one had created swung its hand down to swat Hidan, who deftly jumped over it. Stabbing the golem in the wrist several times did little to slow it down, but Hidan was able to dodge the next slap, which instead took off the rock monster's other hand. Grabbing onto the golem's head, Hidan leaned back hard. The momentum was enough to separate the golem's head from its body, but only once it stupidly added force to Hidan's attempt by punching him. Hidan shouted in glee as the pain spread throughout his body, and the force of the monster's punch took off its own head as it crumbled to dust. It would have been an acceptable loss if Hidan died like a normal person. Akatsuki caught the scythe as it swung downwards at him between two massive mitts of stone that coated his hands, but the three-sharp blade pierced through the stone and nicked his hands anyway. Hidan pulled his scythe back, taking a nice taste of the tiny amount of blood on his side's longest blade while his two opponents watched on in curiosity mixed with disgust. Yeah, that's the kind of stuff Jashin wants. I suppose that little cut doesn't hurt much, but now that the ritual has begun, we can experience the ultimate pain together, shouted Hidan as his feet used the blood dripping from his wounds to create the symbol of his religion on the ground. Too late, Kurotsuchi realized that it was a bad idea to let the zealot of Akatsuki do as he pleased. Instead of both sides catching their breath for a second while Hidan ranted, the Akatsuki member was preparing something. "I don't know what you're doing, but I'm going to end this," shouted Kurotsuchi as Hidan's skin became jet black, save for the bone-like markings across his skin. Lava style. Burning uppercut. "Just die already." The female spat a globule of lava onto her fist, which remained unburned thanks to some clever manipulation of her own bloodline's chakra. "Now, the ritual is complete. All that's left to do is the fucking hell bitch," shouted Hidan as Kurotsuchi's flaming fist connected with his chin. The blow was a complete surprise, mostly because Hidan had his eyes closed as he prayed to his god. Glaring at the girl, who was very surprised that Hidan was still alive let alone conscious, he slashed at her with his black spike. It dealt a painful blow to her gut, and out of instinct Kurotsuchi grabbed a hold of it before Hidan punched her away. She had a rather impressive grip on the spike that was lodged in her abdomen, and pulled it away with her when Hidan punched her in the face. She looked around for Akatsuchi, wondering why he was standing around when their opponent had her injured so badly. She also wondered why Hidan was just standing in his blood circle raving like a madman. She finally found Akatsuchi, barely conscious with third-degree burns all over his chin. "I'll get to you later for daring to interrupt a sacred ritual of Jashin," shouted Hidan irritably. "Now where was I? Oh yeah. Die fucker." With a rather unceremonious end to his ceremony, Hidan raised his scythe up, bringing it down awkwardly to stab himself through the chest with all three blades. Akatsuchi convulsed in pain as blood practically exploded out of him. In sharp contrast to Akatsuchi's dying look of anguish, Hidan's face was one of pure bliss. "That feels fucking good," he moaned out as the markings across his body faded to reveal the blood-covered skin. Kurotsuchi was scared. She had agreed to be one of her grandfather's bodyguards, assuming that no one would dare attack a meeting of the most powerful ninja in the world, and even when Akatsuki did blow down the front door, she had only thought about showing off her strength. Losing had never crossed her mind. Now losing was looking like the only outcome. Hidan grunted as he pulled the scythe out of his chest, wiping the blood off of it with his Akatsuki cloak. "Now then, I'm going to make this one hurt. After all, I have all the time in the world to make you pay for interrupting my ritual." Kurotsuchi tried to back away from the approaching monster, but the spike still embedded in her chest prevented her from moving. Hidan twirled his scythe before dropping the tip into the small pool of blood that had escaped her wound. As Hidan turned to walk back to his ritual circle, his skin became black and white once more. Hidan turned back around to face his victim once he was in position, pulling out another spike to enact his ritual. "Now then bitch, a quick death is too good for someone who dare interrupt Jashin's ritual. What should I do to you?" Hidan smiled sadistically as a brilliant idea came to him. It had been a while since he had been able to take his time with a sacrifice, what with his money-grubbing partner always telling him to hurry up. "Let's break you mentally first. Let me hear those fucking screams." Genjutsu, Jashin's vision. Hidan's genjutsu was peculiar in that it was completely unbreakable and could not be avoided by any means. The only downside was that it could only be cast on the user, and was a mental torture like no other that would not stop until it had ran its course. The very reasons that had made it useless and forbidden in the hidden hot springs village were what made it perfect for Hidan's line of work. Jashin's ritual didn't just link the flesh, but the mind as well. Any kind of pain was a delicacy to Jashin and his servants, and mental anguish could be used without killing the sacrifice too soon. Hidan's vision turned red as he found himself suspended on a metal rack floating above a sea of fire and a rain of blood, held down by dozens of spikes impaled through his limbs. A grin found its way to his face, knowing that the little girl from the hidden rock village would be experiencing the exact same genjutsu he was. The only difference was that he enjoyed every second of it. A demon's bellow rang out through the genjutsu, seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. A massive pillar of fire erupted from the lake of flames below and engulfed the entire apparatus holding Hidan down. The flames died down and Hidan was ran through with a massive scythe, wielded by a shadowy figure composed entirely of pain and suffering and blood. While Hidan knew that his genjutsu world's approximation of Jashin was nowhere close to the real deal, it was close enough for the purposes of the genjutsu. The god of pain seemed to flow down his scythe, traveling into Hidan's body and filling it beyond the brim with indescribable pain. Accustomed to the pain though he was, Hidan couldn't stop convulsing as he screamed in ecstasy. In the real world, Hidan lay on the ground writhing in equal parts pain and pleasure, laughing all the while. Several yards away, Kurotsuchi writhing in pain and horror, screaming. Hidan hadn't actually used this genjutsu since being paired up with Kakuzu, who would have just complained that 10 minutes to not even kill a victim was just a waste of time. Kakashi's hand sparked with a loud chirping sound as he punched his way out of the rocky prison that he had been trapped in during the explosion. The prison had been draining his chakra at an alarming rate, and he wasn't about to lose any more than he had to. Looking around the room with his Sharingan, Kakashi quickly identified his opponents as some of Orochimaru's followers. While he was glad that he wasn't fighting a member of Akatsuki 1-on-1, 4-on-1 weren't much better odds, even if they were weaker opponents. "Hey fat ass, that didn't work," taunted the only female of the group, poking a rather rotund individual with his hands on the dome of rock that had trapped Kakashi. "Tuya, a girl shouldn't talk that way." Tuya smacked the orange-haired man on his head with a thin piece of metal, which upon further inspection was a flute. "Bite me, fatso," said Tuya, drawing out the last word mockingly. The larger man grit his teeth, but otherwise remained silent. "Oi, let's get down to business and end this quickly, otherwise Kimimaro and Lord Orochimaru will never let us live this down," said the apparent leader of the group, a blue-haired man with what appeared to be a second, limp head coming out of the back of his neck. "Let's finish this piece of trash by the book." He jumped back, along with the red-headed female and the six-armed member of the squad. Biting down on his thumb, he ran through the seals for a summoning. Kakashi's Sharingan widened as he ran forward to try and stop the leader of the group from summoning an ally. The fatter member of the four-man squad slammed his hands on the ground in an attempt to stop Kakashi from interfering. Earth Style, Earth Shore Return. A large rectangle of rock rose up between Kakashi and his targets, and he performed his own seals on the run to break through the defensive barrier of stone. Lightning Blade. The blue lightning in his hand tore through the lower-leveled Earth Style like it wasn't even there, and Kakashi continued onwards to attack the three that had jumped away from the front lines. He stopped mid-air as the large man below reached up with surprising speed and grabbed hold of his ankle, swinging him around with a loud shout like a ragdoll. "This way," shouted out the leader, and his comrade was eager to comply, throwing Kakashi towards the other three before the Leaf Ninja could free himself with his lightning blade. Summoning Rashomon. Slamming his hands on the ground to complete the technique, he summoned a large red gate that rose out of the ground behind him, raising the other two members of his squad high into the air of the cavernous room they were fighting in. Kakashi's hand thrust the lightning forward towards the leader of the group, intent on taking him out immediately. The smart thing to do would have been to retreat to the top of the wall, but Orochimaru's underling actually ran towards the hidden Leaf Jonin, rearing back his own fist for a punch. Their fists passed, each traveling towards the other's face at great speeds. Until Kakashi stopped dead in its tracks. His Sharingan had seen the counter of course, but it had been so unexpected, he simply hadn't reacted in time to avoid it. In his defense, it was perfectly reasonable that Kakashi would be surprised by another hand emerging from halfway up the man's arm to grab his wrist. The Sound Force leader brought back his other fist and it connected cleanly with Kakashi's face, twice from the feel of it. Kakashi was sent flying backwards, and he skidded to a stop just in time for the world to fade to black as a sound reached his ears. Suddenly, chains bound him, arresting his movements. Scoffing at the obvious genjutsu that had been easy to detect even without the Sharingan allowing him to see it traveling through the sound waves, Kakashi broke it with hardly a second thought. He ducked underneath the golden boomerang, and then jumped to the side as several more dug into the ground where he had just been standing. "Jesus Kidomaru, you really are useless," berated Tuya, addressing the six-armed Spider-Man who was in the process of spitting out more golden web to shape into weapons. "Well, screw you too," he retorted short-temperedly. "At least he noticed my attack. Did you even cast a genjutsu there?" Tuya was about to respond when the leader of the group spoke up. "This is Kakashi of the Sharingan, of course he didn't bother with a low-level genjutsu like that. Bring out your Doki to help me and Jirobo deal with him. Kidomaru, you take any openings you find to turn him into a pincushion." "Okay Sakan. No need to tell me twice. Shame the game is gonna end so soon though," Kidomaru lamented. Kakashi was almost dumbstruck by their appalling lack of teamwork. That soon changed to appreciation of their teamwork in the face of such hatred and animosity towards each other when they went on the offensive. The four covered each other almost perfectly, Sakon's lightning-quick style that utilized his unique ability to grow more limbs whenever and wherever he felt like was complemented by the slow and powerful style Jirobo utilized. Any openings for Kakashi to go on the attack were immediately closed by golden projectiles courtesy of Kitamaru. Wary of any more genjutsu when he heard the sound of the flute start up again, Kakashi was just downright surprised again by the 3 large ogres that came at him swinging wildly with clubs, claws, and one using its body as a large battering ram. That answered his question about what the Doki were, and would have overwhelmed any lesser ninja with sheer ferocity and numbers. Kakashi was an elite of the Hidden Leaf Village though, and what the ogres had in raw power, they lacked in skill. In addition, their wild attacks had forced Jirobo and Sakon to back off a bit, lest they be struck down by the massive creatures in the crossfire. Given what he had observed, Kakashi didn't think anyone would really care about their comrades' well-being. Dodging the haphazard attacks was made even easier by the Sharingan, and he formulated an insane plan to regain momentum in this fight. Jumping on top of the monster's club as it crashed down on the ground next to him, Kakashi jumped up onto the large metal weapon. Reacting as anyone who didn't spend a lot of time studying taijutsu would be expected to, the ogre flung its weapon upwards in an attempt to fling Kakashi off. On one hand, this should have never worked, as Kakashi could have easily fixed himself to the club with chakra. On the other hand, Kakashi didn't want to waste his time fighting mindless summons when he could use such a base reaction to take the fight to the one who was controlling the monsters. The Sound 4 had no idea what to think as Kakashi went flying through the air as if he had been launched by a catapult, which he kind of had been. Blue lightning raced down his arm as he flew towards the top of the giant red gate, and more specifically the person engrossed in playing her flute. Kitamaru threw the golden kunai he had crafted, but they were swatted away with ease by the epitome of lightning-style techniques. The piercing chirp of the lightning blade was enough to cut through the sound of her flute, and Tuya looked up just in time to panic. To Tuya's credit, she managed to raise her flute up as some kind of last resort defense. It was made of a sturdy metal, capable of deflecting kunai and shuriken with ease, but the musical weapon stood no chance at all against the technique that got its name by cutting a bolt of actual lightning down the middle. The flute, coupled with the far too late attempt at dodging,